Hi, everyone. My name is Akhil with Stop LPD Coalition. Welcome. If you are just joining, this is our second Tuesday of the month meeting that's devoted to our fight against the war on youth. And if you are muted right now, that's because we have faced a lot of Zoom bombing before. So as we proceed, we'll have lots of opportunities for discussion. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to post in the chat, which is open, or you can message one of us or use the raise hand feature to unmute. But as we have more time for discussion, we'll also be able to allow people to unmute themselves. And if you're just coming in, please post in the chat your name, your pronouns, and if you have any organizational affiliation. Also, if you are a teacher, and especially if you're with the LA Unified School District, LAUSD, feel free to let us know in the chat, or a social worker, a PSW. So let us know, that would be awesome. And if you can, please fill out our sign-up sheet, which I'll post one more time for you all. Here you go. Sign-in sheet here. And we'll have a QR code for that too in a second. But those are just some quick kind of like housekeeping tasks before we get started. So on to you, Celine. Celine, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, I think we should take a few minutes to make sure everyone introduces themselves and fills out the sign-in sheet.
Oh, got it. Sorry, yeah.
Hello, everybody. In the meantime, I just want to welcome folks again. My name is Nadia. I'm a teacher and also with Stop LAPD Spine. And basically today we were hoping, to get teachers, counselors as well. So this is one reason we're asking folks to introduce themselves in that way. Because we're really, we've been building with teachers and students and counselors. And so the idea is to continue doing that. And so this is our welcome to our second Tuesday of the month, our War on Youth meeting as well. I think like Celine mentioned, if you could please introduce yourself and then we'll get started in just a couple minutes.
Welcome as you're coming in. Please fill out our sign-in sheet and feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, names, pronouns. Let us know if you're a teacher or an educator or a counselor, or if you work with youth. This is a teach-in for teachers and other people who work with youth about school surveillance, and specifically programs such as countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism. So we would love to know if you are a teacher or educator, and feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, which is open.
We can go to the next slide because it has the QR code too. Okay, and as folks are filling out the sign-in sheet, I'll share a little bit about the hosting organization. So this session is co-hosted by Palestinian Youth Movement and the Stop LPD Coalition. The PYM is a grassroots anti-Zionist organization of Palestinian Arab youth who are organizing towards liberation and right of return for Palestinian people and all displaced people. And we're really looking at the intersections between the war on terror, Zionism, and surveillance, as well as policing and anti-Muslim racism. And a lot of our work includes political education, youth programs, community political ed, and community programs, cultural programs, including our Resistance Arts Scholarship for Arab youth. We also do work around freedom for political prisoners, and we're also co-organizing alongside Stop LPD Spine Coalition to combat militarization, surveillance, and policing locally, including this campaign that we're going to be talking about today, which is our campaign to end national security programs that are being implemented in K-12 schools. And we're also looking at academic complicity as well, and combating the way that countering violent extremism, which we'll talk about throughout this workshop, is also implemented through academic institutions as well as K-12. And I'll pass it to Nadia to share a little bit about Stop LPD Spine.
Hello. Sorry about that. So hello, everybody. Again, I'm Nadia with the Stop LPD Spine Coalition. Akil, feel free to go to the next slide. So just a little bit about us, if this is your first time joining our meeting, we have meetings every Tuesday. The second Tuesday of the month is dedicated to the fight against the war on youth, which we are partners with the Palestinian Youth Movement on. And this is a little bit about the coalition. We are an abolitionist organization rooted in Skid Row. And these are just a few of our fights, as well as also gender and sexuality, defund surveillance, and others. So feel free to go to the next slide, Akil. Celine, did you want to talk more about PYM or? Good, okay.
No, we're good.
Cool.
Yeah.
So basically, this is our idea of what we would like to be able to get through today. The last couple meetings we did, we had really amazing, some of our partners come on and talk about their work and the things they're building. And so what we really want is for July and August for us to just, kind of dig deeper on CVE, countering violent extremism and similar programs. And so what we're hoping is between these two webinars, then that would give that good background and also ways for you to get involved and also connect to your own work. Because I imagine all of us here are doing our own work in our fight against the various wars happening against young people. So we'll start off with the grounding. We'll talk about what CVE is, the framework, how it exists in schools, right? Which I think for those of us in education or connected to youth in general should concern us. We'll have a breakout activity. We'll be talking about ethnic studies as well and how this ties to the fight for ethnic studies. How are we building power? How are you all building power? And then also uplifting Students Deserve work, who we've been working with as well. And then just talk about some ways to get involved. So that's the agenda. So I'm just gonna jump right in and I will, you can go to the next slide, Akil. And so just gonna give you a little bit of political grounding. Feel free during my presentation, during this part, to put any questions. You are able to message the hosts. So you're welcome to message us with any thoughts or questions, and we can either I can address them as I go or afterwards. So this basically right here is looking at how one of the coalition's values and things with principles is that surveillance and state violence are not moments in time, but continuation of history, as well as the fight back against it. And so for us, these programs that CVE fits within, which Celine is going to talk about, it looks at how Black and Brown and Muslim and immigrant and Indigenous youth, and really any youth deemed other, are being targeted as, quote, violent extremists, as gang members, and being treated as basically threats to national security. So it's really kind of elevating it to that level. It's been elevating it, and now it's becoming more legitimized. So as it says there, we are building power and fighting back. Next slide, please. Oops, can you go back? Sorry. There was, ooh, okay. I think it was supposed to be a different slide because this is actually our Stalker State. That's okay. Yeah, I put one in there. That's fine. Don't worry about it. No worries. You can just keep that one. This is actually a diagram. So this is actually called the Stalker State diagram. And what it is basically think of it as various Venn diagrams. And so just so there's no confusion, this is actually called Stalker State. Our architecture of surveillance is another image. But what the Stalker State says is it looks at the different ways and different components of our lives of how our communities are traced, tracked, monitored, and essentially stalked. And this is why we call it the Stalker State. So you can see different circles here, right? Whether the public sector, which really affects all of us. I mean, all these circles affect us, but that is looking at schools, social media, the police, libraries, DMV, hospitals, Department of Health, housing, of course, higher education as well. And then in the middle, we have what we call the LAPD architecture of surveillance. And because we're based in LA, it made sense that that is the police department, of course, we are going after, that we're fighting against, on top of the fact that it is the #1 murderous police department in the country for years now. And so that looks at the various components of LAPD. Now, of course, this looks a little overwhelming. I'm just going to go over it really quickly. In the middle, underneath, we have fusion centers, which are basically these hubs where as information gets collected on us through the various means, through our day, our night, through the things we do, it gets funneled into these fusion centers and then distributed to agencies. We also have the Department of Justice or Injustice, right? The Department of Homeland Security. And then to the left, we have the private sector, which is looking at the various ways that companies have historically and continue to make money off of Black and brown bodies and youth as well. And so basically, when you look at all of these circles, again, it can seem overwhelming when you see it. But part of our thing around building power is when you look at it, you can already see programs that through sheer community power, we've been able to get rid of. For example, in the middle, there's Predpol and Laser. Those are two programs that because of the pressure of the people showing up every week, constantly exposing this, going after LAPD, lifting our power, Predpol and Laser were defeated in Los Angeles, right? The drones, right? The drones is where in the circle of the private sector, and also part of LAPD's, their arsenal, their weaponry. People were able to keep the drones grounded for a few years. And so they did start their pilot program, but again, how are we chipping away? And that's really what we talk about. The journey of abolition is how are we constantly chipping away? Just wanted to bring that in sort of as we talk about CVE, how it fits into these various components. It connects to the private sector. There's money to be made on surveilling and criminalizing. The public sector, LAPD has their own version of CVE as well, right? And of course, Department of Homeland Security is the author of CVE. You can go to the next slide, Akil. And so I'll be talking about this later, but this is a work in progress. It's the Youth Stalker State. One of our youth organizers named it Yes. Basically, she called it the Y'all Ain't Slick Stalker State. Let's fight back. So that's a work in progress, kind of looking at how youth particularly are targeted. You can go to the next slide, Akil. Thank you. This is the architecture of surveillance. I won't go too much into this. It is on our website, but basically those are the components, the data collection, right? So the surveillance piece, looking at policing strategies and tactics, racial profiling, of course, and corporate profit, which goes hand in hand with state violence. Next slide, please. So with this one, this is, we could spend a lot of time on all of these, but this just really shows how the history of policing and surveillance is nothing new, right? Of course, COINTELPRO is one of the more known names that comes to folks' mind. And COINTELPRO went after the Black Panthers, right? The Young Lords, the American Indian movement, and various other movements as well. With the idea was to disrupt, dismantle, and neutralize, right? But surveillance didn't start with COINTELPRO. That's what we have on there, the Lantern Laws and slave patrols. So the Lantern Laws were laws basically that said during slavery, where a person who was not white had to hold a lantern to self-identify as a threat, to let people know, I am not a white person, I am a Black person walking, and to basically self-criminalize, to force that. So this we can see as surveillance. It's literally monitoring somebody's very movement. Of course, the slave patrols, as many of us know, the original police of the US were the slave patrols. Even they had the very similar star to the sheriffs. And so we go through that. We go through Jim Crow, of course, the Red Squads, which was before COINTELPRO. I'm not really going to go into too much of these. And then we fast forward, right, to gang injunctions, right? So we're basically deeming certain areas as gang injunction areas, and certain people, whether it's having a family member or a friend, or if you are wearing a certain color, if there's more than 3 people standing in a corner, right? And then I'll be talking about in a minute about the suspicious activity reporting program as well. So this, we have more details on this on our website, so feel free to go and check that out as well. And after this, I'll put a link to the website. We can go to the next slide, please. And so one of the things, right, is in this is looking at how the gang member and violent extremist label have come together. And this is nothing new as well. We see this groundwork really also being laid in the 80s, 90s. But of course, we know 9/11, 2001 was what really kind of allowed this connection to be more legitimized, right? So how young people, how Latinx people from Central America being viewed as gang members and terrorists, right? Violent extremists. And then of course, even having programs here in LA comparing the war on gangs to the war on terror, right? Where soldiers were being driven around by LAPD throughout LA, especially South Central and towards East LA as well, showing, look, this is our war, these are our enemies, and training them in that way, right? And then of course, our fight against academic complicity, which is the role academia has in this. One example is the fight against Jeff Brantingham, who's a UCLA anthropology professor, really going after him and various academics, which the movement and the letter that's been written against him has been signed by various grad students, faculty, and different colleges, universities around the country. And so, yeah, just wanted to mention that as well. So what is the role then, and especially us as teachers, right? How are we seeing the role that formal education has had and continues to have in state violence, right? And I feel like if you're a teacher and a counselor and you're at this meeting, that's something you've already, right, probably thought about. You can go to the next slide, please. So looking at SAR, right? So the suspicious activity reporting program, basically what it did was it legitimized behavioral surveillance. Schools and of course on the street, but schools particularly have been one of the cores of behavioral surveillance, right? What is, good behavior? What is polite behavior? When somebody, speaks up, if it's a white student, they're speaking up for themselves. If it's a Black or a brown student, they're being, what's the word? Not disruptive. Well, I guess disruptive, but there's another word I'm thinking. But sort of how then behavior gets surveilled. And so the suspicious activity reporting program which started in 2008, it really legitimized this surveillance of looking at how can even a thought or a behavior make someone a criminal, right? And so the definition says observed behaviors reasonably indicative of pre-operational planning. So what it's saying is a behavior has been observed by a person, by a cop, by whoever, that reasonably indicates. Now, reasonable suspicion is a legal standard, which is already problematic, and this waters it down even more. And it says that it indicates their behavior shows me that they are in the pre-operational planning. They aren't even planning anything, but the fact that they're doing this means they could be planning something associated with terrorism or criminal activity. And some of the behaviors include taking photographs in public, asking a business their hours of operation, writing notes in public, ridiculous things, right? And so again, this really then lays the groundwork to unroll CVE. Next slide, please. And I'm pretty much almost done. I'll send it off to you, Celine. So, so one thing, right, is this community policing model that we're seeing more and more come as, you know, as police brutality and police violence is making it more to the mainstream level. We are now seeing more reformist responses. One of these being community policing, which it's made to seem less harmful, but in many ways is actually more dangerous because it gives this facade that the community is having this control. And CVE really fits into that, which Celine will talk about how the community is quote unquote empowered to snitch on each other. And so then really to kind of sum it up and help us transition, as I said in the beginning, this is looking at how Black and Brown youth, Muslim youth, immigrant youth, Indigenous and queer and trans youth are being targeted as threats to national security. Next slide, please. I think that is it. Yeah, so let me pause really quick and see if anyone has any questions if you want to put in the chat. And if not, we can also just transition and as questions come up, go to Celine. Yeah, go for it, Celine. You can get started. Or if somebody want to raise their hand too.
I believe Fatima's next. You want to go ahead, Fatima?
Oh, yes. Hi, my name is Fatima. I'm with Palestinian Youth Movement. I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the logics of Islamophobia, which will help us frame this overall discussion. As we delve a little more into what this expansion of preventative policing looks like, we got to understand this as fundamentally connected to the war on terror, as well as the European and American colonial frameworks that preceded it. So one classic framework is this division into a clash of civilizations between a rational, civilized, democratic West and a backwards, authoritarian, irrational East. This framework and patronizing attitude towards the so-called East, especially the Middle East, was most famously studied by Edward Said, who termed it Orientalism, and he discussed how this was used to justify imperial and colonial conquest from the 18th century to the present day. So as Nadia mentioned, this groundwork was laid pre 9/11, and then it intensified Islamophobia and other violence towards communities of color in the U.S. In the post 9/11 context. As the Cold War came to end around this time as well, the fear-mongering about communism as a global threat by the U.S. Was replaced with a fear-mongering about Islam and Muslims. Muslim communities were seen as incubators of terrorism, constant suspects in need of surveillance. A range of anti-Muslim laws and policies were put into place directly following 9/11, including surveillance programs. In 2001, the Patriot Act was signed into law by George Bush, allowing wiretapping and increased information sharing between government agencies. On September 22nd of the same year, The Director of Homeland Security is appointed. In 2002, the Department of Homeland Security is officially created, and in 2003, ICE is created. Guantanamo Bay, also around this time, begins to be used as a detainment and torture camp for individuals, especially Muslims, deemed as national security threats, even by mere suspicion. The U.S. Wages a war on Iraq and wages a war on Afghanistan, which continues to this day under this premise of protecting the democratic Western values and fighting terrorism. And as these wars go on, Muslims in the US are constantly demanded not to question, but rather overcompensate with patriotism and prove their loyalty to America. They're expected to comply with law enforcement and invite them into their communities. There's a narrative of a dichotomy between good Muslim versus bad Muslim. Good Muslims who assimilate and adopt liberal American values and comply with law enforcement versus bad Muslims who speak out, are critical of US policy, don't conform or stick to tradition in any way. And we see this in the indicators that countering violent extremism, the surveillance program, which was first put into place in 2011, we see those indicators perpetuate that kind of dichotomy and stigmatization of Muslims. So with that, we'll move on to the discussion question.
So this is just for folks to put in the chat. When you think about surveillance, what organizations or entities or institutions come to mind? So I'm seeing FBI, DHS, social media companies. Nadia mentioned schools. Any other thoughts? You can go to the next slide. US military. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what Fatima just touched on, the Countering Violent Extremism program and also framework. This is what our campaign is really focused on and what we're fighting here locally in Orange County and Los Angeles, and also on a regional level, statewide level, and on a national level as part of the National Stop LPD Coalition. So countering violent extremism is basically a framework that is based on this idea that there's such a thing as a clear and identifiable path to radicalization or to extremism, and that there are indicators that can reveal when someone is on that path. This is a totally false theory. There's no actual basis for this, aside from racial profiling and racism. And radicalization theory basically emerged around 2004, when European and the European governments and the US government worked to frame the quote unquote terrorist threat as a specifically Muslim phenomenon and to develop a preventative approach to counterterrorism. So basically the radicalization theory had posited that the increased religiosity and politicization of Muslims would lead to an increased threat of terrorism. So, as Muslims become more quote unquote radical by observing religious tradition or expressing any affinity and concern for welfare of other Muslims, they're more likely to commit terrorist crimes, according to this theory. And this framework is also really similar. We see this this history of similar types of policing frameworks of Black communities, including law enforcement's utilization of the broken windows policing model, which theorizes that local, cultural, and social everyday norms play a role in the development of criminal activity, thus justifying the policing of everyday life in Black communities. And these logics are really racist because they imply that criminality or terrorism are inherent to certain communities. And these policing models, these pre-crime predictive policing models, link everyday activity with the potential for crime or the potential for terrorism, and that justifies the policing and surveillance of our everyday lives. And the indicators of extremism, quote unquote extremism, that initially the DHS had outlined in the Countering Violent Extremism program included things like regularly attending a mosque, being concerned about discrimination, not trusting law enforcement, traveling to the Middle East, growing a beard, being critical of US foreign policy. So all things that probably we resonate with, and that would make us a potential extremist under this framework. And the DHS pilots this program in Boston, Minneapolis, and in Los Angeles in 2014. And it was basically really framed as an alternative to law enforcement. And the way it operates is that basically the Department of Homeland Security would offer grants to partner with organizations like religious institutions or educational institutions or service providers or law enforcement departments or mental health service providers to have them basically look for these signs of radicalization and to have those institutions kind of report that information. So it's basically kind of like outsourcing to community institutions to circumvent restrictions on law enforcement. And it's also kind of utilizing and taking advantage of the lack of resources in our communities to encourage them to apply because, the organizations that apply receive funds. And we'll talk more about how this is beyond programs and grants. This is also a framework of policing. And we'll talk more about that when we get to Akil and Kevin's section here in this workshop. And really quickly, I want to just give an example of the program in the United Kingdom called Prevent, which is about 10 years ahead of where the US is at in terms of the implementation of countering violent extremism, where every person who works in the public sector in the UK, including educators, are mandated to report on these racist indicators of extremism. And in the UK, they're also very similar to the ones that we see here in the US. So again, these CVEs really disguised as this like community-led initiative or this alternative or this public health alternative to law enforcement initiatives, because the way they operate is that they partner with these institutions that already have relationships with communities. And community members, they leverage that relationship basically to attain information. So part of our organizing and our campaign work is also doing these educational sessions to help people learn how to identify countering violent extremism so that we know that, either to push back if we see that a community institution has accepted a grant or is utilizing this framework, and to help us organize against countering violent extremism more broadly in our communities and our schools and so on. And we can go to the next slide real quick. There are a couple other programs that I want to mention. One is the Preventing Violent Extremism that was launched by the FBI in 2016, so shortly after CVE was launched. And this specifically was intentionally meant to target youth in K-12, and it relies on really similar indicators of quote-unquote extremism. They include indicators like being too much into one's culture, being in poverty, or being an immigrant, literally as an indicator of extremism. And it's basically an FBI guideline to collaborate with K-12 schools to report suspicious behavior in students. And then we also see the FBI releasing the Black Identity Extremism Framework, which categorizes Black activists as potential terrorists or extremists. And that generalizes organizing as potential threats of violence and really explicitly targets any movements that are deemed anti-police. So as Nadia was saying earlier, we're seeing this like consolidation of this narrative of the gang narrative and the violent extremists narrative. They're becoming more and more intertwined. So CVE is really a form of community policing. It encourages these partnerships between law enforcement and communities, but it also trains, it's about having communities look at each other, looking at our youth through a counterterrorism lens. And they're all of these programs, and this general framework is basically this preventative policing model, which is very fundamentally anti-Black and anti-Muslim, and are really targeting Muslim, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and immigrant communities and is really part of this larger apparatus of state violence and surveillance that criminalizes our communities. And these frameworks also really justify the creation of these information sharing environments and referral networks that encourage this like reporting and this expansion of the reach of policing. So we can go to the next slide. So the reason, again, that CVE is harmful is because, one, it expands the reach of law enforcement into spaces that should otherwise be unavailable to them, to the classroom, for example, and it really intensifies the relationship between the education sector and also multiple other sectors and law enforcement. And it also deputizes educators, counselors, and other service providers to report on community members, youth, and students that are perceived to be prone to extremism. And the final piece is that it really sows a lot of distrust. It creates this culture of suspicion. It chills dissent. It also chills access to services, including education, healthcare, and so on. And we can go to the next slide. So there, this is just a visual of the different sectors that and industries that basically the DHS has actually provided grants to implement counter-violent extremism. So the religious institutions, hospitals have accepted grants, social services, K-12 schools, universities, a lot of college campuses and universities produce literature to justify the expansion of this, the counter-violent extremism as a program, and so on. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so with that, I'll just pass it over to Akil and Kevin to talk more about the framework of countering violent extremism. Also, if folks have questions about anything, please feel free to add to the chat or message privately, and we can respond to them for that.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. So thank you, Celine, for all of that information. So yeah, we're just gonna keep going with it. So essentially DHS is changing their name constantly. Every few years or so, they change their name because they know that once these communities actually understand the real reasoning behind a lot of these programs, community stakeholders see the stigma and there's a stigma that is created around these programs that then forces them to have to create more covert ways of basically inserting themselves in these communities. And on the screen, you'll see two different quotes that we,
Sorry, it's making me annotate the screen for some reason. I don't know how to stop that. It's like this little red dot. Sorry, keep going, Kevin. Sorry about that.
It's all good, no worries. So as you can see on the screen, there are two quotes that we pulled directly from a DHS report actually that shows these findings that actually recommends that the DHS avoid the term counter-violent extremism, which is when they actually move towards a different acronym called TVTP, which means Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. And then at some point in the early 2010s, they then changed it again to the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, right? And the whole idea is to destigmatize the distribution of CVE funds. DHS should explore the option of using third-party intermediaries to distribute these CVE grants, which is how DHS intentionally distances themselves from these programs by hiding the impact and the promotion of the policing in these very covert ways.
Absolutely. And another way that the federal government tries to make these programs harder to fight and also tries to propagate them is by basically decentralizing them. So as opposed to the PREVENT model in the UK, by the way, sorry, I'm Akil, Stop LAPD Spying. I introduced myself at the beginning. As opposed to in the United Kingdom, where these programs are really centralized under this statewide program called PREVENT. Here, one of the most recent goals of the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security is to expand what they call local prevention frameworks in various areas. And they say you could have a local prevention framework for your school or for your county or for your state or for your a region as a whole. And generally what they consist of is a collaboration, a multidisciplinary team between basically counselors, therapists, law enforcement, administrators, if it's at a school site, or other basically other non-police that are basically collaborating with the police on this. And the whole goal is basically just to expand and propagate this whole framework rather than just focusing on discrete grants. Instead, it's a whole way of thinking about policing that they're trying to expand, which is basically what they call holistic or even public health focus, but it's really expanding policing even more past the police into other entities, into other aspects of daily life. So it becomes even more important to be able to recognize the programs for what they actually consist of, their ideology and the way they work, rather than the name. Because they're gonna, as soon as one program gets a bad name, they're gonna change the name. In Boston, it goes by Operation 250. In New York, it goes by the name Deep. You know, in LA, they had CVE for a while, and then now most likely these programs are continuing through the Department of Mental Health through the name PATH, or providing alternatives to hinder extremism. So all these different local names, and then the federal government keeps on changing the names. So it's better to understand what are the principles of this type of policing, and we can fight that. So one of those is kind of this really war on terror, emphasizing terms such as hate, extremism, and domestic terrorism. So when, instead of acknowledging the presence of something like white supremacy and white supremacist violence that's threatening communities of color, instead, by calling it domestic terrorism, what they enable is that the money that people want spent to protect them from white supremacists will go to strengthening basically a white supremacist system that will then criminalize leftists, Muslims, Palestinians, Black activists, indigenous activists, etc., as domestic terrorists as well, or instead. Another thing is the use of behavioral indicators or risk factors, basically behavioral surveillance that assumes that everybody, or at least certain people in certain communities, are on a pathway to radicalization, and that you can identify, here are the behaviors that they're doing that show that they're on that pathway. Another thing is these third-party grants to community organizations that outsource policing. An emphasis on safety, and more specifically even that the law enforcement, it should be your source of safety from white supremacists. In other words, this sort of savior mindset where rather than community power to defend ourselves, we have to strengthen a white supremacist system at the expense of Black and Indigenous people, for example, to protect us from anti-Asian violence or anti-Semitism or other threats. Let's see, what else? Oh, multidisciplinary teams, which we already covered, that involve therapists, mental health, academia. Another thing is this false equation between right-wing fascist violence, white supremacist violence with movements for justice. So basically the sort of Trojan horse where they say they're going to go after white supremacy, but then they end up targeting the left and communities of color, which is very a very common pattern with US history. And then finally, building trust with law enforcement. So basically grants that involve taking communities that are extremely violently policed and saying that the answer is not that they should have the resources they need to thrive and that they should stop being policed. It's that they should learn to trust cops that are actually trying to do them harm. It's like telling fish to trust a shark. So maybe we can move on to the iceberg now. Kevin, go for it.
Yeah, so what we mean by iceberg of CVE is essentially this idea that while we are much more familiar with secondary and tertiary forms of surveillance policing programs and grants, right? So secondary programs are programs that are considered preventative, in which police work directly with, like, let's say, youth, right? And try to reduce gang violence by working directly with these youth, or tertiary programs, which are essentially just outright imprisonment, the prison industrial complex, very direct suppression of these communities. CVE is part of what we don't see, right? What's considered much more covert, and is part of this policing framework that we've been mentioning, and is part of the Venn diagram of surveillance that Nadia had shown earlier, right? And while CVE programs don't always directly involve policing, what we can normally see is the normalization of the state's definitions of extremism and terrorism, which is especially prevalent in a lot of public educational systems. The stigmatization and the casting the suspicion on these communities, the reproducing of anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab, and anti-Muslim racism, the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism in a lot of settings, the providing PR for the police. So when y'all see those commercials that are like glamorizing these police officers, though, that is a form of CVE programming, and the creation of essentially a culture of policing within a lot of these educational, mental health, and religious spaces. And oftentimes this isn't even like all of it too. Like there are these ideological and cultural grants that oftentimes focus on education and this idea of modeling or theorizing proper citizenship, right? And is considered preventative in the sense that it oftentimes partners with academia and a lot of university spaces in order to create these cultural programs that are part of this academic complicity, not only at the university level, but also at like the high school, middle school, elementary school level, right? The K-12 level. And so all of these things are part of like this like much more deeper rooted and much more covert culture around policing that exists in the United States, and is why it's kind of all considered part of the underwater, because it's not made for us to understand from the get-go. But once we are able to identify that and identify all the language, as Akil said, and as everyone's been talking about, it's much easier to see like just how big of an issue this is in the way that it's built into a lot of aspects of our lives, especially as educators and as students.
Yeah, and this is kind of what we say when we might be asked a question. Well, what's wrong with bringing in, for example, a respected institution to talk about terrorism and extremism to youth? Well, if in one breath they're talking about the KKK and at the same time the Black Panthers, which is literally how a lot of these organizations talk about it, that is doing a huge amount of harm. It's equating white supremacy with people resisting white supremacy. It's also kind of normalizing this idea that there is such a thing as an objective definition of extremism or terrorism, terms that are extremely political. So basically CVE grants span the range of ones that have very overt, clear harm to ones that seem innocuous but really are supporting those same programs that are actually about stifling dissent, curbing political activism, targeting communities, etc. A question to put into the chat: who do you think the state would criminalize as violent extremists? Maybe based on your experiences in the US, your experiences with the state, who do you think the state would target under that framework of violent extremists? Feel free to put it in the chat. Communities, organizations, ideologies, etc.
A lot of good answers in the chat so far. We have us, right? So Palestinian Youth Movement and Stop LAPD Spying would definitely be under that framework. Indigenous youth, most definitely. We have land protectors, very true. Palestinian activists, especially college students. We see likely anyone critical of the state and identifying at the intersections across state violence. Very true, covers a very broad spectrum of people who are definitely marginalized by this structure. youth and people who speak up against the state, communists, mutual aid organizers. People with disabilities, very much so. Yeah, so as y'all are seeing, there are definitely a lot of people, a lot of organizers, and just folks who are marginalized by these structures that would definitely be considered violent extremists just for opposing the state, and by making that and communicating that and making that very visible. Yep, people trained in armed self-defense, street medics, very true. People watching cops.
So we just have a one or two more quick things to add in this section, but thank you all for these amazing answers. This is what the federal government's current framework is regarding violent extremism. Under the CP3, which is the new department that Biden created, I always forget what it stands for, but I think it's Community Partnerships and Programs or something like that. And under this, they also released basically a guide, a public document that lists how they're going to police domestic terrorism and what they call DVE, domestic violent extremism. So here are the categories. And it's really interesting to see what they chose. They have racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism. Notice they don't say white supremacists. They chose a category that was ambiguous enough that it could describe both white supremacists and people resisting against white supremacists, because you could, I guess, say they're both racially motivated. Similarly, for animal rights and environmental violent extremists, they accuse these activists of only perceiving the exploitation or destruction of natural resources and the environment. So, it's very gaslighting language in all of these that accuse people of only just perceiving injustice. For abortion-related violent extremists, they make sure to target both pro-life and pro-choice beliefs, which again is the equation, because which one has historically been violent? It's people targeting doctors who perform abortions with violence, people who target women who are trying to get abortions with violence. So it's very clear that this is a pretext. Similarly with this anti-government and anti-authority violent extremism, this was released in the wake of the attack on the Capitol. But if you notice very clearly, there's something called anarchist violent extremists who oppose capitalism, governing institutions, and perceive them as harmful to society. Perceive them, and they basically they pathologize people who believe that the U.S. government is a totalitarian regime by saying that this is an extremist belief. And they even accuse people of only perceiving economic, social, or racial hierarchies. It's also, Selena's pointing out, it's worth noting that they don't even list the word Muslims here, but we know that Muslims will still be disproportionately targeted under this framework. The other thing they did list in this guidebook is that under anti-government and anti-authority violent extremism, they made very clear to specifically list Puerto Rican national violent extremists, specifically people who are seeking an end to the colonization of Puerto Rico as violent extremists. They also have this catch-all, all other domestic terrorism threats. So it's really interesting to see kind of how the Biden administration is approaching this. On the one hand, they're trying to sort of cloak this in sort of a liberal framework of sort of equal opportunity policing. But on the other hand, they're also very clearly dictating what their priorities are. They're going to continue going after land defenders, going to continue going after people who are resisting police violence, etc. So I think that that's it for our section. Celine, were you going to touch on this before the
Yeah.
activity?
Yeah, I just want to give, so we're going to do a much deeper dive into what CVE is actually looking like in schools in Orange County and in Los Angeles in August, in our August session. But just to touch briefly about like generally what it looks like. Again, as I said earlier, the education is marked as a site of radicalization or potential radicalization by the FBI and the DHS. And so in terms of what it actually looks like practically in schools, it can look like a school starting an after-school program with police to quote unquote build trust between police and students. It can look like educators getting trained to look for indicators of extremism and radicalization. And the reality is that this is institutionalizing another arm of the school to prison pipeline by deputizing educators and school staff and training them and social workers on campus to training them to further criminalize students who are Muslim, who are Black, who are brown, who are Indigenous, who are immigrant youth. And we know this already happens, this criminalization already happens, but the expansion of the countering violent extremism framework will really increase the referral networks and that reach of law enforcement, because it's not even just law enforcement that are going to be doing this monitoring. They're again deputizing educators and people who work at these schools to actually do that for them. And creating these multidisciplinary teams that include teachers and school staff and counselors and law enforcement. So again, it gives law enforcement access to these spaces that should otherwise be unavailable to them. It deputizes, it's meant to deputize educators as proxy national security agents to take on that work of law enforcement, expand the reach of the criminal legal system into our schools and our communities. And some of the examples I have on here is a program in Boston called the Youth and Police Initiative Plus, the YPIP program, funded by the DHS, really targeting Somali youth in middle and high school, treating them as potentially susceptible to extremism, as especially susceptible to extremism. And the stated objectives of this program are to quote unquote enhance understanding of the violent extremist threat within the Boston Somali community. So already assuming that that exists and criminalizing them because of that. And so already assuming that there is such a thing, and that would justify the surveillance and the policing of Somali Muslim community in Boston. The second objective is to quote unquote build resilience in the Boston Somali community among youth to reject violent extremism. However, this resilience, again, it's one of these like this language that we have to look out for in these DHS grants, basically means that they have to build partnerships with police if they don't want to be seen as quote unquote extremists. And if you look at the questionnaire that was given to these high school youth, you can see how deeply anti-Muslim and racist these questions are. So the questions include things like, would you agree that Islam encourages violence more than other faiths? How much support for extremism do you think there is among Muslims living in the US? And how many Muslims, if any, are anti-American? So it's already making all of these assumptions. These are really racist questions. Questions were given out at these schools. And again, we can see like some of this language that Akil was talking about earlier, that where they're really repackaging countering violent extremism and trying to frame it in different ways constantly so that they're able to like really implement it without community noticing what it is. So ultimately this goal is to create more of a partnership with police, to manipulate these relationships of trust that already exist between students and their teachers and their counselors, and to mandate them to report on indicators of extremism. These were questions asked of students, at the school. So it's really ridiculous. And I'll also mention that there's this example of in the UK, again, because the PREVENT program is years ahead of where it's at currently in the US, and it was launched earlier there. Again, where everyone in the public who works in the public sector is mandated to report on these indicators of extremism. What was released is that like these counter-terror police across the UK have actually been running a secret database containing details of thousands of people. A lot of them were Muslims that were referred to the government's PREVENT program. People were actually deported because of this and incarcerated because of this program. And we saw a case in the UK where a 4-year-old was actually referred to law enforcement because his teacher thought he drew a bomb when really he was drawing his dad cutting him a cucumber, and the teacher thought he said cooker bomb, so he was referred to the counter-terror police. And this just illustrates how there's no real grounding for referring a student to prevent. Educators have been trained to look at students as potential national security threats. And in this process, also no consent is sought from parents in this referral, even during mandatory schooling hours. So there's been this common trend that several cases in the UK have shown that parents have no knowledge that their children are actually being questioned by prevent personnel. And we've all actually been talking to a lot of organizers in the UK because a lot of teachers there have built up this campaign against prevent in schools. And we're doing the same here, educators, not informants, right? Building up our organizing against implementing these in schools, organizing with teachers and students and parents here. And so this is where the CVE programs in the US are headed, and it shows how deeply racist these programs are, how and the tangible consequences that can result from this type of reporting, including lack of students' willingness to participate in school. And it's not only about these referrals to law enforcement, but these deeper consequences, such as deportation and incarceration. And also a lot of the testimonies of families show that these experiences have really traumatized youth and their families. Students are scared and nervous and reluctant to join in class discussions for fear of being suspected of extremism. And one of the, I also want to mention one of the organizers in Minneapolis who was combating CVE there said that the CVE program has caused, I'm reading a quote from her, caused immense harm to the communities that it targets, from fear of bias targeting to unjust prosecution to stifling civic engagement. Young Somalis and their families continue to experience loss even after the program's end date. CVE has policed and criminalized Islam and Somaliness to the point that some young people are self-censoring to deflect targeting. CVE has eroded community trust by embedding law enforcement with nonprofit organizations, public agencies, and philanthropy, and created a blueprint that continues to fuel similar initiatives under different names. As we said, this continues to be repackaged. So even if they say that they've terminated countering violent extremism, again, it's been renamed over and over to targeted violence and terrorism prevention, and most recently, the CP3 program. So again, like this is our campaign here locally is between Palestinian Youth Movement and Stalker State Coalition is to really combat the implementation of these programs in our communities and also specifically in schools and in education more broadly. So we were going to do a breakout activity, but I think it's okay if we just, because I kind of already covered one of the case studies, the life of the program, maybe we can just share screen and have a collective discussion about, we're just going to go through an example. I think it would be good to go through case study 2. I don't know, Akil, if you can share that. Basically, we're just going to read through this sample grant program together and reflect on the red flags that we noticed. Like, what is the language that we're noticing in this grant description? Who is the target? Like, what communities is this are these directed at? Who would be directly impacted and how? So if we could do the screen share this, and would love everyone to participate. Either you can unmute yourself or participate in the chat. But we're going to read through this together, and the case study 2, the crisis intervention of Houston. So this is an actual CVE program in Houston. And we're going to read through this case and then discuss, like, what are we noticing about the language here and who is this aimed at? So let's see. And again, as folks are coming in, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. All right, so does anyone want to, let's read through this together. Does anyone want to volunteer to read the first paragraph? And are folks able to unmute themselves? I think we should be good to do that.
I'm going to change it so that people can unmute.
Okay. If anyone wants to volunteer to read the first paragraph here, crisis intervention of Houston, reaching out to the most vulnerable. Okay, no worries. Okay, so Lorraine can read it once she's able to access.
Are people able to unmute now?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Celine, you want me to start with crisis intervention?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks, Lorraine.
Sure. Crisis Intervention of Houston, founded in 1971, is a crisis hotline call center that serves Houston and the immediate surrounding counties. The nonprofit organization provides around-the-clock free anonymous crisis intervention and suicide prevention counseling and exists with one concise mission: to help people in crisis. The center represents a public health approach to prevention and intervention of harm to self and others. In 2017, Crisis Intervention was awarded a 2-year DHS CVE grant to develop a new crisis intervention hotline aimed at Muslim youth, known as the Act Now Hotline, develop a new CVE training module for call counselors, and conduct outreach into the Muslim community to raise awareness about the new hotline. The purpose of Act Now Hotline is to provide culturally competent crisis prevention and intervention to Muslim youth who have concerns related to violent extremism.
Thanks so much, Lorraine. Would anyone like to read the second paragraph here? Feel free to just unmute or volunteer yourself in the chat.
I can read it.
Sure.
These concerns may come in a number of forms and include one or more of the following. One, personal susceptibility to involvement at some level in violent terrorism. Two, concerns regarding a relative's or friend's susceptibility to involvement in violent extremism. Or three, concerns related to past or future victimization stemming from violent extremism.
Thank you. And Charles, can you read this last one, please?
Sure. The CVE training module for call counselors, which has been incorporated into the standard call counselor training, provides additional information about the process of recruitment and radicalization and the vulnerabilities, that is, risk factors for youth radicalization. In many ways, the CVE training components mirror the standard crisis intervention training that call counselors undergo, but with violent extremism framed as a crisis situation instead of suicide or another form of self-harm. The outreach to the Muslim community was conducted by a local nonprofit organization, the Alliance for Compassion and Tolerance, because of its strong ties to the Muslim and refugee communities within the region.
Thanks so much. So that's the case study, and we'll leave this up here so folks can take another look. And
Celine, can I
yeah.
actually like pull up the slide too that lists the different components of CVE programs and go back and forth so people can look at that too?
Yeah. And it would be great if like folks want to just like react in the chat or unmute yourself, like just right off the bat, like what language are you noticing here, or what red flags are we noticing about this grant description? You can just list words in the chat that you heard even.
Oops. That's not right.
For me, it's really interesting that they're talking about susceptibility to extremism and specifically doing outreach to the Muslim community in Houston.
I think it's also interesting that they specifically say like concerns regarding a relative or a friend, just encouraging people to report on each other.
It's a really good point.
I think it's also they chose a third-party organization that they say has strong ties to Muslim and refugee communities. So using organizations that have already built up a certain amount of trust to then sort of like approach the community with distrust, you know? So there's this sense that law enforcement and DHS and the groups organizing this already don't trust the communities, but they want the communities to trust them.
I was just thinking as I was reading it that, you know, Muslims typically don't share with families and communities anything related to mental health. And so I think it takes a lot of courage for somebody to seek help and call this hotline, but then to understand that that can also be weaponized against our youth is really heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's like in cases where like we've seen people realize it, it's totally deterred them from wanting to seek mental health support again, which is really, it's just really frustrating. And they make it sound so, when this is presented like, oh, we're countering extremism, it's tough to think about why that might be a bad thing. But it's really interesting. Like, I'm curious, like, what is the training module? Like, what are these indicators? They're not talking about here, but because we know about this, like what in general, like what the DHS has outlined, they're talking about really basic things that our community does, like someone who is critical of US foreign policy, or someone who's very active in the Muslim community, or someone who goes to a mosque a lot. Like, these things are all indicators that could be weaponized and used against them. Also, if folks don't want to unmute, feel free to just type in the chat, or if you're having mic issues, feel free to type in the chat anything that's coming up or any language that you find interesting here.
I also think that we can remember the information sharing environment in the Stalker State at this point and think about how these calls might be recorded, how they might be in the hands of police, how they might be analyzed, and how certain calls might trigger these chains of events that lead to like a person's information ending up in a fusion center or in the hands of federal agencies. So
That's a really good question. What kinds of questions are being asked when people call in? When a youth calls in, what are they being trained to ask?
I'm thinking a lot about the language about like culturally competent crisis prevention and how violent extremism and culturally competent. I feel like I hear the word culturally competent as an educator all the time. So it's just like all these things are mirroring things that are already happening in schools as well. So I'm just like, that's where my mind is going. And I also wanted to second like how it's just, yeah, so deplorable that it's like people reaching out for mental health and they're met with this situation. So yeah.
Yeah, and you can imagine how this also gets implemented in schools. Like, if people are trying to confide in their teachers or in their counselors, and they're being trained on this, how are they supposed to respond? And that's the frightening thing, is like in the UK, they have to report, like they're mandated to report on specifically these indicators. Like, that's integrated into what they're supposed to report on. It's really insidious the way because I think initially this program also gets created because they notice that communities know when the feds are in their space, and they don't want that in their space. So how can they create something where the feds don't have to be there? They can actually ask our own community members to do that work for them. Any last thoughts?
just as a refresher, this is some of the different bullet points that we had come up with earlier for how to recognize the program even when it doesn't go by the name CVE. So notice that some of these are true for that crisis intervention one too. Grants to community organizations, posing as like a way to provide safety, incorporating mental health, behavioral indicators and risk factors. And then the language of extremism, of course.
And the other thing is that I think that confidentiality laws don't apply if there's a quote unquote national security threat. If I'm correct, so like how does that affect that?
I think isn't it also tied to like if you're harm to others or yourself, that's also exactly where the confidentiality is.
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks for participating in this activity. We'll get back to the workshop, but we just wanted to have this kind of practice to identifying like how we notice this language of countering violent extremism come up, maybe in like local organizations that we're that are in our city or in our county. We can go to and we're gonna talk more about like how this can actually impact youth in schools, but also how we're building power and we're fighting back and how we're organizing. And then we'll have some time for more questions. So I think I'll pass it to.
I think Paul is next.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. All our facilitators so far, and and to everybody who's in the audience. How's my sound? Is everything coming through clearly?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Thank you. And there was a question on the previous slide. If we have time to just ask one more question, of the chat, and just respond in the chat. What do you think the impact of these countering violent extremism programs would be on schools, on the climate in schools, the social and cultural climate, working conditions, studying conditions of students, working conditions of teachers and other education workers, paraprofessionals, everybody who labors in schools, and also caregivers, families. Yeah, I see a kill, but I think it will sow a lot of fear and distrust. And looking at, when we were thinking through that case study just now together, we came to see how fear and distrust was really anticipated from the beginning, and instead of seeking any kind of process, any kind of democratic process or involvement or any kind of consent, we see these surveilling and policing agencies trying to circumvent that by manipulating and exploiting existing relationships. Isolate students and families. Yeah, thank you so much, Lorraine. That's absolutely true. And one thing that I would like to touch on before, and please, more, let's see more in the chat. Yeah, transfers policing to teachers, counselors, etc. Everybody, every education worker at public schools is a mandated reporter. Everybody down to every adult there who spends, you know, a significant time. Yeah. So, yeah, and just that's just one thing that I was thinking of when we were working through that case study as well was, yeah, how it isolates students and families, and also when it comes to teachers and administrators in our schools, we understand that demographically these tend to be, you know, overwhelmingly people who are not from the community, and this is in public schools, are not necessarily from the community that the school serves. Tend to be, you know, overwhelmingly white women in K through 12 public education. And in a community like mine, where there's, you know, a growing and visible population of, you know, refugees, and especially Muslim refugees, there's an opportunity, to me, there's an opportunity there for, you know, for education workers who aren't from the community to do a lot of harm, you know, even meaning well, not intending harm necessarily, but just through reporting, you know, their suspicions about extremism and projecting their own biases onto their Muslim students. And of course, their, you know, the same would extend to their, you know, black, brown, indigenous students as well. Yeah, so thank you everybody for thinking about that. Next slide, please. And so continuing on for that thought about, you know, pivoting from the impact and our concern around the impact of these countering violent extremist programs at school, especially the way we've seen them deployed in the UK, you know, having mandated reporters have to report on these behavioral, you know, suspicious behaviors, which are all filtered through the biases of the individual reporters. There's a way that I see it as an educator who's been following the struggle to get ethnic studies into K-12 public schools in California. How there's a fair amount of overlap in the in the kind of policing of student organizing and student activism, and students' freedom of speech, and teachers and education workers' freedom of speech and academic freedom is really threatened by the implementation of CVE in our schools. And I know we had some an ethnic studies you know, at least one ethnic studies educator in the audience, and I'm not sure if they're still here, but I'll try to do as much justice as I can to explaining, you know, to the development and you know, the history of ethnic studies as a struggle, as a student struggle, as a radical struggle to demand ethnic studies that itself would probably have, you know, if students today tried to undertake the kind of militant organizing to demand, to take collective action and to demand ethnic studies and the creation of these educational programs that, you know, set the record, that correct the record in our history and social sciences. If that kind of struggle was undertaken today and a CVE program was implemented in schools, those students would be surveilled and criminalized, likely for that kind of organizing. And so, of course, the struggle for ethnic studies, starts over 50 years ago at the university level with a coalition of student organizations that comes together to form the Third World Liberation Front at San Francisco State and at UC Berkeley a few months later. And ethnic studies was born on those campuses through militant struggle, street demonstrations, and this led to a lot of surveillance and confrontation with the police. And in the intervening years, as ethnic studies departments have been created at colleges and universities, and within a couple decades of 1968, had actually managed to gain some support in the K through 12 public schools because of, again, community and student activists demanding that their real histories be taught, and the rejection of the history and social sciences curricula and the curricula of the status quo more broadly. It finally started to make its way into high schools, and now in California we're actually working towards having a mandate for ethnic studies courses in our K through 12 schools, although that fight's still ongoing. And ethnic studies, of course, has really it continues to be a site of struggle because it purposefully is a kind of a way of teaching that encourages students to think critically, develop an analysis of oppression and power, and encourages students to organize, ultimately. When done correctly, students who have been in ethnic studies courses are motivated, understand how power works, and are motivated to come together and organize to create power and to use that to whatever ends they see fit. However, looking into a future where in California there's ethnic studies in all public schools, imagining what implementation of CVE would do is pretty. It's a pretty disturbing kind of field, in that we simultaneously would have courses that are encouraging students to organize, but at the same, and especially along the in the tradition of of militant struggles, of community struggles that are grassroots and not necessarily through the kind of approved mainstream channels. Unfortunately, it seems that the kind of surveillance and policing would break down along the lines that we've seen historically, time and time again, where our most marginalized and oppressed students are more highly surveilled and policed. And looking at these new domestic violent extremist categories, ethnic studies doesn't just motivate students to take action, along the lines of their ethnicity, but as well to just organize for power, because of course all students will be, should be learning in these courses to have an analysis of power. And so with, under these kind of definitions, if you had students who were organizing, who held anarchist viewpoints and or socialist viewpoints, those pro-choice viewpoints, those environmentalist viewpoints, those students could be criminalized and surveilled under the whole CVE framework. Next slide, please. CVE is also an attack on academic freedom. Ethnic studies educators are definitely scrutinized. There's in a lot of instances of that, and of course now we're hearing all about these right-wing narratives, these white supremacist narratives, and this kind of fury about critical race theory. To those of us who are educators or education workers, or anybody who's been paying attention to the fight over ethnic studies and the ethnic studies model curriculum in California, knows that the influence of, like, not only critical race theory, but of just critical theory in general, and its role in ethnic studies and the history of ethnic studies, and that the authors who are often taught in ethnic studies courses, they were railed against and opposed using extremely similar narratives that suggested that what the ethnic studies model curriculum should include is a celebration of diversity and a focus on equality, and not on an analysis of oppression and power, but instead as kind of an apolitical yet another zone for kind of patriotic education, ultimately, or a restriction on it where things wouldn't get too unpatriotic, and kind of a lot of that fights over ethnic studies in California has been how much of a chilling effect should be put on teachers' discussions in classrooms. Which brings us to the whole subject of censorship. CVE implementation would almost undoubtedly contribute to teachers, especially younger teachers who are still employed under, like, probationary contracts. They would almost certainly be scrutinized, and they could, within your first couple of years of teaching, if you're, have a new credential, like, it's a very opaque process, and this, a school board can refuse to hire you on for another year for basically any reason, and there's not a lot of due process. So it's undoubtedly an attack on academic freedom. It could give, yeah. So thank you very much. Next slide, please. Yeah, and once again, like, the people, individuals, students, education workers, teachers from the most oppressed communities with CVE implementation would almost certainly be under the most scrutiny, and their organizing is not a threat to our democracy. And yeah, there's going to be more to talk about that in the August workshop. Really hope everybody will come to that. Invite your friends. If historic patterns are allowed to continue, then CVE will ultimately contribute to the school to prison pipeline for our Black, Brown, Indigenous, Muslim, and Palestinian students and colleagues. Next slide, please. So myself, I'm a member of one of the statewide teachers unions in California, the California Teachers Association, and throughout the process of writing the ethnic studies model curriculum, once the legislation went through to create ethnic studies, there was a big fight over what to have in the model curriculum, and the CTA position is really reflects the original authors of the ethnic studies model curriculum, which people who know about ethnic studies understand reflects more the spirit of ethnic studies put forth by the Third World Liberation Front, and is more true to the guiding values and principles of ethnic studies. And CTA policy in our organizational handbook really takes a very strong stand on ethnic studies, and CTA policy supports academic freedom for all members. Policy encourages students, community members, education workers to be engaged in activities and organized to promote social justice. CTA policy opposes racial profiling. So if you're a member of a union, if you're not a member of CTA, I strongly encourage you to go out and find, learn about policies, learn about the policies of your union, learn how they can support you in organizing against CVE. All of these are really just meant to show that there's a precedent in teachers' union policy that we really need to appeal to our leaders, and we need to organize and talk to each other, talk to our fellow workers about how we can't allow CVE to be implemented, and it's something that our union has to take a stand against. We've taken a stand against similar things in the past. So yeah, definitely it's important to start having these conversations in the union, because solidarity is the best defense against CVE, and start talking to people in other community. If you're a member of other community organizations, it's time to start talking about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. Yeah, and just as a quick kind of like coda to that amazing rundown about the threat that CVE poses to ethnic studies, it's not only that CVE itself poses a threat to ethnic studies, but that some of the same organizations that support CVE and have facilitated sort of the expansion of CVE are some of these same organizations that have actually targeted ethnic studies either for elimination or for being watered down and co-opted. So, an example of that is the ADL, or the Anti-Defamation League, which is, a very prominent Zionist lobby that, claims to be a civil rights organization, but is very actually in bed with law enforcement, with federal agencies. And this organization has officially partnered at least in several CVE programs, including in Houston, in Boston, in Colorado, and it has partnered. It has a lot of partnerships, especially in Orange County. But they even went to one of the first CVE convenings to brag about their work in helping to create the Boston framework of CVE. So they're very tied to CVE, and they were one of the organizations that fought tooth and nail against ethnic studies in California until they were successfully able to censor Palestine from the model curriculum, to the extent that all the draftees of the model curriculum actually decided to remove their names because of that level of censorship. Another example is the Simon Wiesenthal Center or Museum of Tolerance, which received CVE or related grants. It received a Preventing Violent Extremism grant from the state of California, and then the TVTP grant from the Department of Homeland Security. And they're also one of the organizations that fought against the California's model curriculum and ethnic studies plan. And finally, you have the American Jewish Committee as well, which has been working with another group called Muflehun, which is a Muslim Zionist organization that received a TVTP grant as well. And the American Jewish Committee similarly is supportive of CVE and also organized a sort of like multi-faith, multicultural opposition to ethnic studies by instrumentalizing groups such as Hindu groups or Korean groups or even Assyrian and Greek groups as basically saying, all of these groups don't want there to be an ethnic studies unless it includes them, which was not actually in good faith, because these are not some of the groups that have had historic ties to the Third World Liberation Front that fought for ethnic studies since the beginning. So basically you have examples over and over again of organizations that are facilitating surveillance and fighting for censorship of education in schools, which are really two sides of the same coin. So moving on, just wanted to, and also if you wanted to learn more about that, again, to reiterate what Paul said, we'll be going more into detail about these parallels between censorship, student repression, especially the Palestinian movement, and on other topics in the August webinar for teachers as well. So now I think Nadia and Michelle.
Yes. Hello. Thank you so much for sharing that and everything. And so just wanted to kind of transition and close the meeting to really talk about how we've been building power, how, and also see how you all in your communities are building power as well. And so one of the things is, and one thing I wanted to also say is we are hopefully going to be this same workshop, because we know there were, okay. Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah, no problem. Yeah. I'll hold off on that. So just wanted to then start off by saying some ways we've been building power and fighting back. So one thing is just really about knowing our fight. A lot of times we talk about know your rights, which of course we should, but it's really also knowing our fight. What is it that we're up against? How have we been building? What can we continue to do? Also just organizing with teachers, students, young people, parents, families, doing workshops like this as well. One thing we'll be doing is we're going to be hopefully doing this workshop again. We have our part 2 in August, which will be different, and Celine can talk about that as well. But we're going to be repeating this workshop too. So please, if you, feel free to invite other teachers, counselors, social workers. I know myself, I did reach out to a few of my coworkers who I really trust and am building with. They couldn't make it, but hopefully the next one they will. So please feel free to share that. The other things we've been doing too is filing Public Records Act requests, which are basically, it's the public's entitled to different information, right? So on a national level, you have Freedom of Information Act. California's is the Public Records Act. And a lot of times these tend to be thought of as lawyers have to guide them and create them. But with the coalition, with us at PYM too, we basically create these together. They're community-based, right? The other thing too is doing taking on academia, so doing college and university convenings as well, doing art skills sharing workshops, and then of course continuing to imagine and create what we can around what real safety looks like. A lot of times people think, oh, abolition, the way we're thinking of abolition probably won't happen in our life, right? But how are we at least continuing to build towards that for our future generations? And then of course going to City Hall and the Board of Police Commissioners as well, and just continuing to expose folks, expose the institutions, LAPD, DHS, and then of course creating different videos, outreach material as well. And so we invite you to join us in that. And then, yeah, so you can actually go to the next slide, please. So one of the things too is also part of building with teachers was building with UTLA, so the teachers union, right? And really what that helped us do, so there was a motion passed against both preventing violent extremism and countering violent extremism. And this pledge, this motion actually played a major role in pushing the mayor to reject a grant for CVE. And of course, really it's not to his credit at all. It's to the pressure, it's to people showing up to City Hall, young people, their families, and of course, this UTLA motion as well. And I was thinking, yes, hell yeah, we did. We kicked out CVE out of LA and OC. We did, definitely. And then of course, out of California too. And so the other thing as well is also trying to just do general convenings, whether it's with students, so like high school students, college students as well, and of course this building with teachers too. We have an educator's pledge that's almost in its final stages to be sharing. And basically, so just please keep an eye on that. What that's going to do is going to really build that and show, okay, which of us as teachers, who of us are willing to say, no, we're not going to participate in this, right? And of course, knowing that potential backlash, that's one thing we're also looking at and creating is, okay, so when there's backlash, when us counselors, teachers, those of us working with young people, when we refuse to participate in this violence, how do we then fight against this backlash, right? So that's obviously a part of this as well. And so, yeah, I'll go ahead and also pass it to Michelle to just kind of see how y'all are building power and of course, lift up students deserve work as well.
Cool, thank you. Hi, my name's Michelle. I just wanted to show this Instagram post from Students Deserve. Students Deserve is based in so-called Los Angeles, and in June, so like literally last month, they had another huge win. So in addition to what they won in February was no school police will be stationed at any LUSD school when we go back in person, which is a huge win. And Students Deserve is led by Black youth, Black parents, and Black educators who are working to literally defund school police and abolish school police, and also taking those funds and redirecting it to support Black youth and Black student achievement. So I'm going to drop the link in the chat so you can follow them, support all the work that the youth are doing. They're working really hard out here and doing amazing, amazing things. So if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So in the chat, I invite you to name any youth-led organizations in your area. I know we're not all like based in so-called Los Angeles. So any youth-led organizations who are building youth power to end policing in schools, to end surveillance, kind of like doing the work we've been talking about. So I'll go ahead and take a minute to let you flood the chat with any ideas you have. Awesome. So yeah, we have the BLM-LA Youth Vanguard. Nice. Thank you so much for sharing these. Very cool. And yeah, what Nadia said, like, feel free to name any fights or campaigns that need support as well. Thank you so much. Yes. All right, cool. Thank you so much. You can go to the next. All right, cool. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. So we're going to close now. We have a little bit of time for some questions, but just really, so again, we have these meetings where we're actually building out the strategy for our campaign against CVE in schools and against CVE in our communities. We meet every month to build out that strategy and working on our on our educators pledge and our workshops, on our actions, upcoming actions and things like that. So we really encourage folks who want to get involved to fill out this interest form. And you can join those meetings. We can also send like follow-up materials if you want, more about the content we presented today, or you want to get involved in those monthly meetings. Please fill this out and we will follow up with you. And our next meeting is July 21st at 6 p.m. So Wednesdays at 6 p.m. or every third Wednesday of the month. And other ways to get involved are, again, you can request a workshop. We do have a curriculum built out that we present to educators, but also to high school students, also to college students, and different materials and political ed tools that we share. You can also follow on social media, join our email lists. The social media is here. The email lists are also here on section 4. And we can go to the next slide. So yeah, some of our some of the components of this campaign include, we have these like monthly strategy meetings. So we have these monthly educational meetings on the second Tuesday of every month. Every third Wednesday of the month we meet together for strategy. And of course, there's a lot that happens in between. And we have workshops, our pledge, and yeah, just really encourage folks to fill out this Google form so to get plugged in. Thank you so much, Lorraine, for joining. It was really good to see you and have you here. Yeah, hope to see you at one of these Wednesday strategy meetings. And we can go to the next slide. So yeah, if folks want to just use the QR code or use the bit.ly link, please fill this out. And again, we're having another session to talk more about the organizations that are actually implementing CVE in schools here locally, and talk more about student repression or political repression in schools and how we are fighting back in more depth in August. So really encourage people to join that. That would be on August 10th. Yeah, and we'll close. Does anyone have any questions? If no one has any questions, just take a few minutes to fill out this sheet if you're interested in joining this campaign. And it doesn't matter also where you're based. Like, we have folks join from DC and Maryland and other places. So feel free to fill out the interest form. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Celine. And yeah, and as you're filling that out, as you're doing that, I want to also invite folks next Tuesday to our coalition's general meeting. Yeah, and I don't know, Hamid, are there any other announcements for Stop LAPD Spying?
No, just kind of putting it out there that the fight around policing of unhoused communities is going to be amping up. The city council finishes its recess. They are bringing back the extremely punitive ordinances that communities fought back, particularly LA Can, and our family there. So just putting out a call to action to everybody to be suited up, because it's going to have a very dire impact on a lot of unhoused communities and the violent policing that's going to happen. So yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Does anyone else have any announcements or anything happening in their community where they need any support? Okay, well, yeah, we'll go ahead and close out, you all. And again, please you join us on this part 2 of this, where we'll also be talking also more about strategy and collaboration as well, which will be August 10th. And yes, please, if you know other educators, counselors, students, feel free to invite them as well. Great. Well, y'all have a good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, we'll see you all next time, hopefully next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Good night, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you so